Hey, I'm Vern Redekop, professor of conflict studies at St. Paul University, and I want to talk to you about how communities can be transformed through a community dialogue process. And what we're looking at is social reconciliation, in that there might be some underlying negative dynamics as people are in tension within the community, and economic development is really something that's forward-looking, that brings people together. So let's start with a story. I had occasion to visit Bosnia and Herzegovina back in 1999, which was just 4 years after the fighting, and I saw the bombed out buildings in Mostar, for instance. 10 years later, I was going back fairly regularly, and as I went into Bosnia, I had this sense that people really didn't want to talk about the fighting that happened back in the 1990s. As one friend said, you know, people want us to get over the 1990s. He says, we're not even over the Second World War at this point. So I had the idea that maybe if we did something that was focused on the future, on economic development, we might come up with a process that might work for them. And so that was the genesis of the conceptualization of a process that we tried out in Hobbema among the Cree people of Alberta, but we'll get to that later. I want to start now by telling you about an experiment that was done with fish. In this aquarium, little fish were put on one side, big fish on the other side, and there was a glass barrier in between so that the fish couldn't swim to other sides. So they were kept segregated by the barrier. After a while, the barrier was removed, and what happened is that the fish stayed on their sides. They did not swim to the other sides, even though there was no longer a barrier between them. In effect, the barrier was in their minds. If the barrier in their minds was removed, then it would have been perfectly possible for these fish to swim freely from one side to another. And I use this as an illustration because very often within communities there are barriers that are in people's minds. And these barriers inhibit them from doing things that might contribute to their own well-being. So if we think about the barriers being in our mind and having to do with thought, then we can draw on David Bohm, who is a pioneer in really developing the capacity of human beings to dialogue. So he says basically that our actions come from thought. Our problems, any problems facing humanity, really come from our thought, and therefore our solutions have to come from thought. So the question then becomes, how do we think together to overcome the impediments to living a good life that we value? And even this question is a combination of ideas from two different thinkers. Paul Ricoeur said, our challenge is to live a good life with and for others in just institutions. So we could say that's part of the question. And Amartya Sen, who really worked on thinking through human capabilities and how we can do things better, thought that the essence of what we're trying to do as we develop our capabilities is to live a life that we value. So there are many challenges in post-colonial societies, post-authoritarian, post-communist kinds of societies, and post-conflict societies. Now, as I was working on this concept for Bosnia, we had a consultation here at St. Paul University, and I gathered a number of people together, and among these was Verna McGregor, with whom I had worked at the Assembly of First Nations on economic development issues. And her initial thought was, what do I know about Bosnia? Why do I want to come to this? But I gave her the discussion paper that described the conditions, and she said, wow, the people in Bosnia are facing exactly the same challenges that we indigenous people are facing on reserve. So these challenges have to do with living in misery some of the time, very difficult to take action. There's been a departure from traditional values, as one elder told me. He said, we indigenous people have such wonderful values. He says, the problem is we're not living them. Then there's also a problem with addictions in many of these communities. Lateral violence, which is when people take out their violent inclinations on their peers, on the people from their own community. There are black markets, as in Bosnia. There's a lot of human trafficking, drug trafficking, and so on. And there's favoritism. So in Bosnia, for instance, you have huge ethno-cartels whereby people from the same ethno-cultural group have controls of the local economies, and they favor people. For instance, a priest in Sarajevo said, if you're a Croat and you want to set up a business in Sarajevo, you have to promise in advance that you're going to hire only Bosniaks. And you could probably see the same kind of reality in places where the Serbs were dominant, or places where the Croats were dominant. They would want to favor their own. So if we think about taking action, let's look to the integral theory of Ken Wilber. And he said if we want to work in a holistic, integral kind of way, we have to take into account, first off, the external parts of our reality, things that we can see, things that are observable, and so on, and what happens inside ourselves and inside our communities, how we experience things. And so if you look at this particular scheme here, you can see the exteriors on the right and the interiors to the left. Above the line is individual, and below the line is collective. So if you think of it, if you want to take action, you need to have an imagination. You have to imagine that you could do something. And if this relates to your identity, so much the better. If you have a passion, it's going to carry you forward and give you some motivation. It's then important, if you're going to take a prolonged kind of action or do something that works toward a bigger goal, to have a strategy. And one of the most important things then is how do you take the first step? Because a lot of people get bogged down. They think, oh, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that. And they don't know how they can do one thing that's going to start leading to the bigger reality. So making it more simple, we can say that action takes place because of thought. So the thought is something that is inside our mind, body. We think about something. And the actions can be either basic actions, a simple thing that you do, or a chain of action where one thing leads to the other, or action practices where the action is an ongoing thing. It becomes part of your, in Pierre Bourdieu's terms, part of your habitus, part of how you do things all the time. And you can, if you think about your life, you can say, well, I'm into some action practices that I'm not really pleased about. I wish I could change them. They might have to do with eating habits, as in my case. I'm really trying hard to lose some weight. Or they might have to do with things that affect your relationships negatively. So changing action then starts with changing thought. And if we want to work at a collective level, we have to learn to think together, and that's where dialogue comes in. So we're thinking about community-based dialogue processes where we're open to creativity. There has to be a structure to it, to bringing things together, but also this openness to go with the flow, because when you are open to creativity, sometimes the most significant thing that happens is something you never planned. And if you can pick up on that and harness it, it's really important. Always relationship-oriented. And in order to really work together, we need trust, we need to validate one another, we need affirmation, we need acceptance in order to move ahead together. And in a community, if you leave some groups out, it's not going to build relationships all around, and you're sowing the seeds of future disappointment if you do not include all the groups within the community. It's hopeful in that you have a sense of expectancy, not knowing exactly what's going to happen, but yet realistic in that you are aware of the challenges. And I should say that one aspect of this being hopeful yet realistic is to look at the whole process from the point of view of what do people bring to it. So even in places where people are living in misery, they are extremely creative, and we can look at some places where you look at what are their incomes and so on, and you can say, how can people survive? But people do survive, and they do so by doing very creative things. So we have to start with an affirmation and an eliciting of those things that people are already doing that are really creative and help them survive in tough situations. This all started as I developed this proposal for Bosnia and then had consultation processes both in the Western Balkans and here in Canada to sort of refine the whole thing and be responsive to what people had in mind. Then I was invited by a Cree lawyer named Catherine Twin to adapt this Bosnian proposal for Indigenous people. She then talked about this with her friend Victor Buffalo, who was a key leader among the Musqueam Cree in Hobbema, and they invited me to come in to work with them and folks from CANDO, a Native Economic Development Organization, to hold the first of these three-day dialogues. And I still remember 24 people assembled together in a circle at Ermineskin Lodge. And one of them said, we don't want this to be a flash in the pan. We've had consultants come in and out, and they give us some ideas, and then nothing really changes. We want this to be long-term, and we'd like to have one of these dialogues every 3 months. I figured, wow, that's pretty insightful. I can go with that. And so we had the first dialogue in June, the next one in September, and the next one in January of 2011. And then for a variety of reasons, it wasn't possible for these to continue. And the whole thing went on hold until the folks from James Bay Cree, the EU Ishchi is how they call themselves in their territory, they then extended an invitation to get involved with them. And the week before last, I was in Ujabugamu holding an information session and getting the process started. So this whole thing relies on three essential elements. You need a framework, which we'll get to momentarily. You need an organization, and you need a process. And I'll talk about each of these. When I was thinking about Bosnia, my initial thought was, we need to think about reconciliation because there are tensions between groups that are ongoing. Economic development is our forward-looking kind of process, and they really do need economic development because among European countries, it's probably the most challenging place in which to live. But the matter of ethics is really important because one of the things that I discovered along the line is that for us to have a really good economic system, we need to have certain values. And people in North America, for instance, take for granted the fact that so many things work so well. Like we have millions and millions of transactions as we go shopping, as we exchange goods, as we do things that work for us. We feel good about how much we pay. We feel good for what we get. And in many stores, if we're not happy with what we get, we can take it back. This is all based on a certain amount of trust, goodwill, on being trustworthy in our economic relationships. So ethics become really important. As soon as I was asked to adapt this for Indigenous people in Canada, I figured there's no way we can tackle this without attending to spirituality. And so here was a creative new dimension that was added to the framework because in an Indigenous worldview, everything flows out of spirituality, out of a relationship to the land, out of a relationship to the animals, to the environment, and to the Creator. So it would be foolhardy to pretend that wasn't really significant in the framework. Well, what happened among the Musqueam Cree, after the first dialogue, the people said, we would like to have Manly Begay come and spend some time with us looking at governance issues. I go, wow, that's pretty insightful. We ought to add that to the mix. And after the session with Manly on governance, they said, public-spirited leadership is really important. That is, having leadership that is really devoted to enhancing the community, enhancing the lot of everybody. So public-spirited leadership became the focus of the third dialogue, along with forgiveness, which then, of course, was linked to reconciliation. So this is a sort of thing that's been growing organically as I have engaged different peoples who have invited me to participate with them. So if we think about the modules, we could think about the first community dialogue being on a general one on economic development based on reconciliation, the next one on good governance, then public spirited leadership, and then had we continued among the Muscatchees Cree, they had really said the fourth one should be on holistic economic development. So what happens in a community dialogue? Well, 24 to 48 people meet in an open circle, and we have to think of it that who's important to be there. And my friend Vjeko Domlin, an economist in Bosnia, said, you know, if we were to do this in Bosnia, 30% of the people should really be youth. Of course, you want elders, you want entrepreneurs, you want a variety of people from all the different groups within the community. So within that setting, ideas are presented. So for instance, we could present the idea of values. What values are important in your community? And then people are divided into groups of 6 to 8, and they work on this question in a sense saying, what does this have to do with us? What does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with our community? And they generate ideas with a facilitator. There's a scribe there with a laptop taking notes of everything, and then they report to the plenary session, and after doing this several times over 3 days, at the very end, people start thinking about what actions can be taken in regard to some of these ideas. Suppose it is on values, and suppose people want to start cultivating different values that they draw from their tradition, or they say these are really important for us. Well, they start thinking about how do we change that in our community. At the first one of these, I brought some graduate students to help as scribes, and it was kind of neat because we went from Hobbema to Edmonton for the night, and they started working in the van with their laptops, and they worked into the night so they could present a report the very next morning on all the ideas that had been presented the day before. Now, suppose you want to get started in your community. How do you get going? Well, first of all, you need a mandate from somebody, and you need some resources to get the ball rolling, and you need to extend an invitation. And for me, if I am to be involved, it's really important that I be there on invitation, because right from the beginning, the question is who's taking action. And if the community is taking action, that's better, and I go there as a servant to play whatever role I am to play in order to serve the community as the community starts taking action. You need a local planning committee, partly because the community has to own this, partly because the decisions that are made about this should be made by people who really know the committee, and partly because you need a representative group, so the committee should be made up of representatives from the key institutions, the key family groups, the key stakeholder groups within the community. So the local planning committee plans a dialogue. They decide on a place, set a date, and start inviting people to attend. Gathering a representative group is really critical, because you want the first dialogue to be so inclusive that everybody in the community says, oh, I know somebody on that, or there's somebody there that would sort of speak for me or represent my perspective. So you need that representative group at the very beginning. You hold the first dialogue, and after that you follow up with the working groups, because they've got 3 months until the next dialogue to start taking action. Then you hold the second dialogue group, and people report on their progress and on the process that they've been going through working in the community. And then you continue this every 3 months, and I'm suggesting every 3 months for 10 years. The idea is that this gets woven into the habitus, into the ongoing practice, the action of the community. So people just say it's natural that we do this sort of thing. One of the people at Hobbema said to me, he says, you know, he says, this is what we used to do traditionally. If there was a problem, we would get together and sit in circles and talk about it. And that's essentially what's going on here. People are getting together, sitting in circles, and talking about how they can make their community better. The organization is important. We need a local coordinator. We need a point person. We need somebody with a mandate to follow up with the working groups. We need somebody who's going to gather the steering committee together, somebody who's going to work out the logistics to make certain that everything is going to happen as it should. We need the representative steering committee, community participants. And then when the dialogue happens, we need a process leader, a circle keeper, somebody who leads the larger process, and a resource person. So among the Musquetees Cree, I played the role of the resource person, and we had had somebody who was the circle keeper that sort of gathered the circle. Cindy Gaudette happened to be that person, a Métis woman living in Ottawa who came along to play that role. Down the line, by the time we got to the third dialogue, the process was entirely organized and led by local people. So the second dialogue, I played the role of the process leader, and Manly Begay was the resource person. He was the one with all of the ideas that led to the questions that the people worked on. And a community can invite any resource persons or special people that they might want to have there. For instance, if there's a community that's right close to a mine that's being developed, and the question is, well, how is that mine going to affect local people? They might have been protesting against it if they didn't really want it there, but suppose it's going ahead and the decision is made to go ahead. One use of this community dialogue process would be to invite executives from the mining corporation to say, come and listen to us, listen to our ideas, and let's think together as to how we can make this work out in the best way for everybody concerned. You also need facilitators and scribes, and the facilitators are well trained by the Canadian Institute for Conflict Resolution if they take Third Party Neutral 1, becoming a Third Party Neutral, and then Third Party Neutral 2, developing facilitation skills. They're in a good place to facilitate these small groups. So let's think about the results as the community is transformed. And as the community is transformed, you see that there's another side to the community, because within every community there's a spirit, there are resources, there are talents, there's a history, there's something that really can enable everybody to grow and bloom and flourish. So if there is social reconciliation, what are the results? Well, there's a sense of justice. So people start to say, things are starting to feel a little more fair. There's a change of structures, a change in patterns of how people relate together. Sometimes that might even mean a change of laws, or a change of language, or something that enables people to really live fully in relation to one another. There's healing from trauma, because the kinds of situations we're talking about can involve trauma, and sometimes trauma passed on through the generations. There are new relationships, and as these things start to happen, there's a sense of transcendence, of getting back onto the road out of the ditch, or of connecting with something bigger and transcendent, or transcending the differences that exist between people. The economic development then proceeds in a really healthy way, which is respectful of the environment and spreads the benefits to everybody. There can be different models of economic life. For instance, when I was at the Assembly of First Nations, the National Chief, Ovid Mercredi, asked me one morning, what's the Indigenous counterpart to taxation? I didn't know, and he said sharing. And so you could ask the question, what would happen if you had an economic system that was based on sharing, as Indigenous economic systems were? What would that look like today? And could we find a new way of incorporating that somehow into economic life? And then economic development really works best from a strategic vision, where you can see how development of one thing will lead to spin-offs, and one thing nurtures another, and so on. From the Mohawks, I learned the importance of being of a good mind and heart, the idea of being oriented in a really good way, and that's one of their goals as they think in terms of meeting together and gathering and preparing themselves for dialogue. So our spirituality, values, and our overall orientation is really important. And if we're oriented toward blessing, toward mutual well-being, we respect local rituals and ceremonies that can give expression to spirituality. We educate people, we're open to different traditions, and we're inclusive of all people. And finally, if we think about Manly Begay's framework for governance, he talks about how we need to claim jurisdiction, have a really effective constitution that everybody understands, everybody knows the rules, take a strategic approach with public-spirited leadership, and have conflict resolution institutions so that if there is a problem, there are the means within the community to deal with it. So my hope is that you, as you think about this, will think about your own community, think about whether this is a process that might make a difference to you, and most of all, I'm hoping that in places where people are now suffering because of the thought systems that keep people divided, that there will be a transformation and flourishing in the wake of what people are currently experiencing. Thank you for listening.